This is getting really exciting. Believe it or not, it's 3:50 in the morning. Like I kid you not, and I'm having a lot of fun with this, so I probably won't go to bed anytime soon. Um, anyway, so let's just pick up where we left off. And what happened was that when we tried to persist a project with a project identifier that already exists, we got a 500 error, and we're going to get a 500 error because we have in the project object we do have the unique constraint at the column level. Now, for those of you, I know that some of you understand this. If you're clear as to why this is happening, make sure that you can skip through and just go to the coding section of this lecture. But for those of you that don't understand what's going on here, which I mean, it was me a few years ago, first time I saw this. I'm gonna take a few minutes to explain what's going on, right, and why our brand new shiny validation error service did not help us with this, and I'll tell you why. So this map validation error service helps us make sure that we are getting a valid project object. Okay, it makes sure that the client is passing a valid object, that everything that cannot be blank is not blank, and that everything that has a size constraint, like this one here, actually meets the criteria. However, when the add column annotation, this actually sets a constraint on the database level, at the database layer. So this actually is happening after our object went through the validation service. Okay, so basically our project went through the validation service. Even though this is a duplicate, it understood that this is a valid object, and this service has no way to check in the database that this identifier already exists. Okay, if this doesn't make sense, rewatch the lecture. Listen to my explanation very carefully, because I really want you to get this. Okay, so this is why it didn't catch the error, because the error actually happened when we were trying to persist to the database, and not when we were passing the request body through the validation service. I hope that's super clear right now, and that you guys really understand what's going on. All right, so how are we gonna solve this problem? There are several ways to solving this particular issue, but I am going to take the route of actually creating custom exception handling for this. And the reason being is that I want this course to be a practical project, and creating custom exceptions is usually something that you want to have in your back pocket whenever you are working on projects. Because right now, our validation is working, and this is great, but it is not handling it in a good way, right? This is just an internal server error. Like, this is like, oh my God, the server blew up, pretty much, right? I'm being a little too dramatic, but we're not handling it well. We're not handling this well. And that's the end of it. And that's why what any software development manager or IT manager will tell you. You're not handling this error well. So this is exactly what we're going to start doing now. Okay, so for this, we're going to create a custom exception. Okay, so the first thing that we're going to do here is that we're going to create a new package, and we're going to call it exceptions. Exceptions. Now, an exception in the context of what we're doing right now will have two components. The first component is going to be the exception response, and then the second component is going to be the exception itself. And I'm going to just start wiring that up right now so you guys can see what I mean. And I am going to actually start with the exception response. Okay, so in the exceptions package, we're going to create a class, and we're going to call it project ID exception response. Okay, because this is basically how we're structuring the message. And what I want the message to be is very similar to what we have now. I want it to be, instead of this project identifiers required, I want it to say something in the lines of this project identifier already exists, and I want it to actually pass the same key field here, just with a different message. All right, so I'm actually going to copy paste here. Copy-paste programming is usually something that they'll tell you not to do, but in cases like this where you're talking about very specific attributes, I don't like leaving anything to chance, so that's why I'm just going to copy-paste it from there. All right, so basically here we just need one attribute. It's a private string project identifier. Then we're going to create a constructor that takes that parameter, and then what's going to happen is that when we create the exception, we're going to pass it a message, and then that message is going to return this object, and it's going to say project identifier and then the message, just like it is right here. So basically, remember, this is a JSON object right here. So this is what we're creating. We're passing an object that has a project identifier attribute of type string that passes on a message. This is all we're doing here. And then we're just going to create getters and setters. Perfect. All right, so now that we have our response, we need to go back and start working on our exception. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to create a new class, and I am going to call this project ID exception. Perfect. Now, for this exception, we need to do two things before we start wiring up the code. Hold on. Okay. Hold on. Give me a second, guys. I don't know why. I'm sorry for this hiccup. I'm not sure why it's not letting me type right now. So let me just close this. I think my IDE is just giving me a hard time right now. I think my IDE is tired too, so let me just close it down and try and reopen this again. Apologies for this. It happens. It happens. I promise you, it happens. All right, so I'm just gonna close it down and open it again. This is really embarrassing because I've been defending this IDE as if I own the company, and now it's doing this to me. But anyway, nothing's perfect, so don't worry about it. I'm just gonna reopen the project because I'm really not sure what happened there. Anyway, I'm going to start wiring up the exception, and then the first thing that I want to do is I want to give it the response status annotation, because I want to make sure that whenever I throw this exception, it gives the user a bad request HTTP status code. The next thing that we need to do is that we need to extend the runtime exception class. All right, so now on IntelliJ, whenever you want to create a constructor, if you're a Mac, you can do Control-N, and it'll give you this list. I think on Windows is Control-N. Here is Command-N. And on STS, I know that they have a similar key combination for this little menu. All you have to do is Google it and make sure that you find the right one. I'm not sure if it's Control or Command N for Eclipse or STS, but I'm pretty sure you can find it like in 10 seconds. And what we're going to do is that we're going to pick the constructor that takes a message string. And boom, this is literally all we need to do here. So we're done creating our exception. So the next thing that we have to do is we have to create a response entity exception handler. And basically a response entity exception handler is a class that comes with the Spring framework. And what we're going to do is that we're going to pretty much extend it so that we can have custom exceptions. So I'm actually going to call this one custom response entity exception handler. And I know this is a mouthful, bear with me. Okay, so we have to give this two annotations. The first one is REST controller, and the second one is add controller advice. And I'm going to take a few minutes to actually explain, or a few seconds to actually explain what controller advice is for those of you that don't know. And basically, what a controller advice is basically a mechanism that helps you, break away from having exception handlers that are controller specific. This basically helps you match all exceptions declared with the exception handler, and basically gives you a global exception handling for controllers. That's in a nutshell what this is. So basically, all exceptions that you wire up here, if the controller is throwing that exception, it will come here for advice, literally for advice, and then handle the exception properly. That's in a nutshell what this does. All right. So, and again, since this is a controller in a sense, so this is why it needs to be annotated with REST controller. And we need to, of course, extend then, as I mentioned this before, we're extending the response entity exception handler, which is down here. Make sure that you're bringing the right one. Okay, I think there's only one anyway, so that's probably a silly comment. Now, we're going to create a method, and we first need to give the annotation exception handler. And this is going to be a public final response entity, return to response entity of type object. And then we're going to name it handle project ID exception. Okay. Now, this takes two parameters. It takes the exception that we just created, EX, and then it takes the web request. Okay. Now that we have passed those two parameters there, what we need to do is set up the response. So it's the project ID exception response equals new project ID exception response, and then the exception get message. So basically what we're doing here is that when we do the try catch block, or the if statement where we want to use this exception at, then as you remember, we set up a constructor where we're going to pass on that message. So this is why we are going to be passing the exception message, because it basically takes that string. Okay, cool. So now that we have that in place, then we're going to return a new response entity. I don't think we need this here because it's already of type object. And then the exception response and HTTP BAT request. Perfect. All right. So now that we're done wiring up this, we need to actually put it where we need this exception to be caught. And as I mentioned before, this exception is not being caught at the controller layer or at the map validation error service, because the map validation error service doesn't have any communications with the database. Thereby, it cannot know whether or not this is duplicate at the moment it's trying to persist the object. So what we need to do is we need to come to the project service, and this is where we're going to start actually wiring up some of the logic that we're going to have here. And as I mentioned before, I'm positive that the project service is going to have a lot of logic towards the end of the course. So the first thing here is to set up a try catch block. Okay, so what we're going to do is that we're going to try and persist to the database, and then if we have errors, then that's when we're going to actually throw our new exception that we just created. New project ID exception. There you have it. And then what we're going to say is project ID, and then we're going to put one quote here, and then we're going to do the project object that we're passing. We're going to get the project identifier to uppercase. And actually, this is another change that I'm going to make here in a second. Single quote already exists. Perfect. And before we save this to the database, and so that we don't have a whole lot of ambiguity with the project code, and also to emulate tools like Jira, what I'm going to do is that before we save the project, I am going to set the project identifier. I'm going to set it to uppercase. So basically, the project object that we're passing, we're going to get the identifier, and then we're going to set it to uppercase. This is going to help us a lot also when we are trying to find by this identifier, because if we pass it lowercase, then it's still you know, it's just going to take that ambiguity out of the way. But that's pretty much what I want to do, and also it'll look better once we start using this for sequencing. So this is pretty much the try catch. Now we're going to run this again, and everything should work. And usually when you test, you know, we've done a lot of coding, so you want to test everything thoroughly. So if you pass nothing, everything is good. If you pass it a valid one, it should persist. Perfect. Let's just check the database, because again, I don't want to get cocky. I really want to make sure that we are covering our bases here. Run the query. Perfect. ID 01, project name, null. Perfect. All right, so now let's try to pass this again, the same identifier again. And perfect. As you can see, we're getting exactly the same error message that we set up here, and also we're still able to persist. And if we try and pass it something that's not clean, it works. And then if we try and pass one that's unique too, then it actually gives us the confirmation that it was persisted, and there it is. Okay, so this one was a lot of fun. I hope that you guys learned a lot from this one, and I'll see you in the next lecture.